Well, thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Rudy Escalante. Rudy was born and raised in Santa Cruz and worked in Santa Cruz County law enforcement for nearly 32 years and retired in 2016 as the Chief of Police for the city of Capitola. As Chief Executive Officer for Janus of Santa Cruz, he has served the agency for over 20 years in various capacities on the board of directors. He served as a panelist for a past Calciano event regarding methamphetamine epidemic in Santa Cruz County. Mr. Escalante is a strong advocate for women's crisis support in Santa Cruz County. Please welcome our panel moderator, Rudy.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks to everybody for being here and your terrific community support. In all my years living and working here in Santa Cruz, I think one of the things that attracts me the most is the community involvement and engagement and the willingness to take action when time is needed. And as we know, the time is now and we need everybody's help. And getting the message out and providing the information from the experts that we have today is just a tremendous opportunity. And so I want to make sure that we give all of you participants a round of applause for your community engagement. Thank you. So as you know, we've returned some of our morning experts from this morning. Dr. David Thomas, he's introduced to the group here. Dr. Sarah Duffy, Shayna Zerlin, and we've added a few more folks, which I'd like to introduce you to. Mr. Michael Painter is Director of the Student Support Services Department at the Santa Cruz County Office of Education, where he manages programs assisting vulnerable youth populations in the schools, such as those experiencing homelessness, foster care, probation, gang involvement, mental health, and/or substance use issues. He's a licensed family therapist and recent graduate of San Jose State University's doctoral program in educational leadership, where his research focused on school culture and climate in alternative education settings. Please welcome Mr. Michael Painter. We are also honored to have Mr. and Mrs. Tom and Kelly McQuaid here. And if you could introduce yourselves to the group.
Hello, my name's Tom McQuaid.
You can go ahead and bring it closer.
My name's Tom McQuaid. I live right down the street. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, I live right down the street. I'm a member of the community here. I have a PhD in mechanical engineering. I'm a VP in a local company. My wife Kelly here. I have a daughter who's 23 years old. I love Santa Cruz. I surf, mountain bike. Really just love the area completely. But I guess I am, kind of the embodiment of this epidemic. Kelly and I had a son, Michael. He died almost 5 years ago of a heroin overdose. And so, we're here to kind of put a face on this epidemic that we all face, to answer any of your guys' questions, and just do what we can to help the community heal and move forward.
So as you know, we had a basket out in front at the start of the symposium today, and several questions were placed in there. And I've gone through with a group of experts to try and answer some of those questions and at least present these to the panelists so that they can answer them for you. We've also have a series of questions that we want to try and make sure that we ask everybody, and the questions are kind of designed for multiple answers. So if you have some information you'd like to share on that, please do. Keep in mind we have an hour, so my goal is to get as many questions answered as possible. So why don't I start out with this particular question? Go ahead, sir.
I wanted to introduce myself.
Please do. I'm sorry.
So, I'm sorry, but I'm Kelly McQuaid, and I'm a district nurse for Santa Cruz City Schools. And it's because of this community and the love of my friends and this community that's enabled me to get to the point where I'm not ashamed, and I really want to bring awareness and education and compassion to this disease.
Thank you, Ms. McWade. My apologies for not introducing you. Okay, to all the panelists, I'll start with this particular question. Mental health statistics indicate that clients who utilize counseling, 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, and 1/3 stay the same. Are there statistics about the success of specific clinical programs in treating the opiate-dependent population?
Sure. Yes, there is some data. So if we look at evidence-based practices by practice, you can look at some of the outcomes. There's a lot of research on that. But I think last I checked, generally speaking, what we were looking at is if we were having 50% successful outcomes, folks that were meeting all of their goals and transitioning into a lifestyle of health and wellness, that programs were doing really, really well.
Anybody else want to comment? Dr. Duffy?
I think that's about right. And I'd also like to sort of, again, it's a chronic illness for most people. So you may meet some goals, and you may come. We used to talk about graduating from treatment. What you're doing is you're having periods where you're living a good life, you're working towards recovery, and can get there. It's not like people never get there. But we need to think of it more as a chronic thing and less of thinking about failure or anything like that. I like the idea of failure of treatment, but if somebody reuses or slips or whatever you want to call it, that just means they need more care to me. And so I think that that's the way I'd say it.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was, mental health statistics indicate that clients who utilize counseling, 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, and 1/3 stay the same. Are there statistics about the success of specific clinical programs in treating the opiate-dependent population?
Thank you.
Would you like to expand on that?
I don't have statistics, just experiential knowledge. And there are a lot of famous people who have succumbed, who have overdosed on heroin and opioids. And I think it's extremely important for all of us to understand that it's a chronic disease, and people are in recovery, and relapse is actually a real part of the disease. Whether or not you get counseling, and I know families who, I know one family in particular, I know hundreds of families because I go to conventions to learn more about this, but I know one family who sent their son to 16 different treatment programs. They spent $1.5 million on those programs, and he still died of a heroin overdose. And so it's a chronic disease.
And I would add that there are some states that actually do collect that information from specific programs. I don't know if California does, but like North Carolina has a system where they do that.
Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, make the point that not all treatment programs, not all rehab are the same. There are wild claims with some of them that really do not deliver, and some of them are really expensive and have really little science behind them. And the other issue that's been brought up every time is wait lists. There are people trying to get into treatment. Once you get to the point where I'm ready to get treatment, and they have to wait 6 months, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, capacity is a large issue all around our country. Thank you. How about one for the schools? Mr. Painter, how can schools be more proactive in meaningfully addressing the opiate issue in youth?
Sure. And I did, in preparation for the panel, do a little anecdotal information gathering. You know, really, I'm the Student Services Director, as mentioned, for the county office, and we have a cohort of about 7 folks in that position throughout 7 districts, including Santa Cruz City. And I think he's sitting in the very back on the left here. So we meet monthly and we sort of discuss trends. And then I've worked for 18 years in alternative education, which we have a large group here as well. And so between staff and admin, looking at them, opioids, in all honesty, and I think I got sort of confirmed by the statistics by the several morning presenters, is not huge in the schools per se, in the K through 12 or even high school setting. They kind of instantly listed, marijuana, alcohol, Xanax, polyuse, vaping, like they had this whole list of things they were super concerned about, and that finally started showing up around number 6 or 7. But in the same conversation, and I'll get to your question, Rudy, and I'll try to go faster here. What did emerge was there's sort of an experience where schools, individual staff had relationships with students. They were part of that community. Then they graduated or they dropped out. And then now they're in this 18 to sort of 25-year-old range. And and they still come back because they had connections or they see them, in the community. That's where the use of opioids, whether it's synthetic, prescription or heroin, kind of emerged. To answer the question more directly, though, so all the other issues that I listed around substance use, I think that I feel pretty confident to say that over the last 5 to 10 years, schools in general have implemented more programming. They've hired more social-emotional counselors, more social workers, more family therapists. I think there's a recognition in the supporting the whole child and all the pieces of the puzzle that ultimately generate academic success, which is generally the school's focus. And I think part of that involves sort of a tiered approach. And I won't go into this, but there's a whole approach across the state trying to be implemented that really gathers kind of public health model of the multi-tiered systems of support where there's a general targeted individual. And so I think by strengthening those relationships, that holistic approach and that tiered approach, I think schools can do a lot to prevent and to early intervene so that they don't turn into that 18 to 25-year-old cohort that does fall into more of the, opioid addiction.
Thank you. I'm going to move this question more towards the right side of the panel, everybody's right side up there. What does research report regarding the key factors as to why people start using and then abusing opiates separate from those prescribed for physical pain?
Well, for pain, it's simple. I mean, people get into opioids. A place where people really start opioids, it's in perioperative space. You get them for an injury, you get too many for a month, you might take too many, and then you keep on taking them. In terms of the recreational use, I mean, that's peer pressure and curiosity and things like that. And something that was appealing of prescription opioids is they had the appearance of being safer. People don't like the concept of, I'll stick a needle in me, and it just sounds terrible. That happens usually down the road. But prescription opioids were readily available, and they were strong. They were in the medicine cabinets, and they were prescribed too much so they could be brought out for recreational purposes. But that can lead down a bad road.
The thing I'd like to add to that is I don't think we can have a comprehensive conversation about substance use disorder, whether we're talking about opioids or otherwise, without acknowledging trauma, without acknowledging the role that mental health and trauma play in folks' both initiation of use as well as sustained use.
Yeah, can I follow on that? Because if you look at, and there's been this dichotomy listed or mentioned a few times here about psychological pain, physical pain. They're really not quite different. That's kind of a false dichotomy, that if you look at some of your areas of the brain that respond to pain, they also respond to seeing the face of someone who broke up with you. And I think they're all kind of a gemisch, and that yes, with trauma you might be treating what you call psychological pain, but that's a form of pain that opioids, at least in the short term, can help with.
The next question for Mr. and Mrs. McQuaid. We've seen a lot of the data. One of the statistics show that the number of high school students reporting heroin use has doubled in the past 10 years. How can a community collaborate and support lessening or preventing opioid use in our youth?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So
You know, when Michael started using drugs, it was a shock to us. But you know, we weren't aware at the time of the growing opioid crisis that was rolling across this country. I certainly had, you know, I deal in science, but I'm an engineer. I had no idea that people were getting addicted to OxyContin, that there were these pill mills, that the Sacklers were making billions by selling this stuff. But I think the key really is, you know, is knowledge. So parents need to know, you know, this isn't happening to, what was that grid graphic, the other someone showed? This is happening to people just like you, your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your friends, people in this community who are working right alongside you, maybe hiding from shame, from, you know, feelings of insecurity, the fact that they're battling or their children are battling this terrible disease. So I think the most important thing is for the community to open up, acknowledge the real existence of this terrible plague, and do what we can to keep the kids from getting exposed to these things. I mean, that's the key, right? The prefrontal cortex is not developed. The kids are going to make, if the pills are there, the kids are going to probably take them unless we can really instill a sense of fear and a sense of uncoolness about doing drugs in these kids. So to me, the parents need to be aware that it's out there, it's dangerous. The kids need to be aware that one wrong pill and they're dead. I mean, that's difficult for an adolescent to comprehend, but it's the reality of the situation. And so I think really, I'm getting kind of long-winded here, but really it's raising the level of awareness across the community, I think, is what's required.
Mrs. McQuaid, would you like to add additional comments?
So this epidemic is, like you said, what we have going on, it's a canary in the coal mine. As a school nurse, I'm seeing that not only do we have a crisis with drug substance misuse, we also have a crisis with anxiety, depression, school avoidance, suicidality, cutting, anorexia nervosa. All of these things those are the symptoms of our community that is not well. And we need to teach our children resilience. I'm reading some amazing journals, articles about resilience skills that we can teach our children. We need parents to become educated and knowledgeable, and we need to learn how to parent our children in this day and age. We're in an era that is really, a lot of us just don't know how to deal with the issues that we're facing with our children, with social media and our addiction to our gaming and our cell phones and it's amazing. Our children are in 24/7 nightclubs with their cell phones. We didn't grow up that way, and we're losing our children. So I think that we need a very concerted, organized, evidence-based ways of ameliorating all of these issues that we have, and it's with a lot more mental health services than we currently have, and with a lot more easy access to mental health services. And I think we can do it, and I think that we, as a community, need to do it ourselves. We have to start doing it. And you guys are all perfect people to start working towards helping each other. We need to help each other.
Well said. Well said. Mr. Painter, you mentioned something about the shame piece, and you know, my 32 years, it is finally starting where people are understanding that addiction is a disease, and we need to treat it as such. How can we begin to work to reduce the shame and blame tendency toward those who abuse opiates?
Sure. Well, again, I think Kelly McQuaid, I think you spoke very well. And I think it was Dr. Morris, maybe we talked about this as a crisis of toxic stress, not necessarily just opioids. And so I think a lot of the remedies that I kind of looked at and talked about in schools, I think really address all of this. And whether it's maybe doing the ACEs, looking at ACEs scores in schools or more resilience training or mindfulness. And I know I wrote down a couple quotes, I think from Dr. Hastings, but they were about, the antidote to stigma is empathy, right? And the opposite of addiction is connection. And so I think, I'm thinking of this in much bigger terms, maybe like you, Kelly, about how do schools be small enough, connected enough, relationship focused, student centered enough, so that you understand the shifts in mood, in academic performance, in friendships, in activities, and that the community of schools and folks, because schools really can be hubs for larger communities, how do they respond to that? And so, again, I'm thinking in this larger venue of educational options. And I think just lastly, that Santa Cruz is very fortunate that we have in most districts and at the COE and some private schools as well, a lot of different options to create small settings so that students are known and that kind of relationship and resilience education can happen. And so I think the more of that, the better. And I know it's a challenge sometimes for big districts, big school sites, big classrooms. And so the more we can create that environment in whatever setting, the better, I think.
So one follow-up question again to the entire panel. There still exists a perception that addiction is a moral failing or a matter of choice. From this position, it is the expectation that treatment will cure people based on that perception. And if treatment doesn't do this, there's a conclusion is that the treatment does not work. How do we go about changing that perception? And we've heard where Ms. McWade, you talked about somebody who's been to treatment 16 times, right? And so how do we change that perception from starting here, getting out to our communities? Tough question.
I thought it was for the whole panel, sorry.
Well, yeah, it is, for the entire panel.
Please, Dr. Duffy, go ahead. Okay.
I mean, from my perspective in my career, I think one of the steps we have to acknowledge is that it is a disease, and there is a way to treat. We just don't stop treating people halfway through the treatment.
I'll say a couple, just 2 cents. True is, I think it's back to that. Once you know the person and the story and you hear what's occurring, I think then you treat it as an individual experience, and I think you're able to respond differently than making it the other or making it sort of a disease, I guess. So that's one thought. But.
Yeah, and I would think, part of it's because of science. And you can study the brain, you study addiction, and somebody that has an opioid use disorder, their brains are different, they're working different, and we got to get the perception that the drugs initially are taken by choice, and that's not a disease, that's bad judgment or whatever, but then over time, the brain changes, and if we can identify better those changes and get better treatments to change things back, then we'd see it more as a disease. But for me, the analogy, you could always just say, just don't do it. Just stop it. Like Bob Newhart. If you've ever seen Bob Newhart, stop it. It's not so easy. Stop it. And if you think of somebody that's addicted, they're sort of standing in a fire, and we're telling them, don't jump out. It's your choice. Don't jump out. It's not a choice. If you could see what they're going through and how difficult, they have to jump out, and they have to continue, and we have to help them with their disease.
So I'd like to just elaborate a little bit.
Please do.
Just from our perspective. So Michael was accepted into Cal. 2 weeks later, approximately, he told us, I'm addicted to heroin. And he cried to his mom, I don't want to be a slave to this drug. This is not someone who's having fun, right? This is someone who's locked in a vicious cycle where his brain is not letting him take control of his actions. A week later, so he thought he could just handle it himself. He wouldn't let us put him in a program or anything. A week later, he was dead. So this is not anything he did for fun. This is something that it's clear that his brain had been hijacked by that drug. That he wasn't taking the drug to feel good. He was taking the drug not to feel bad, to try to survive. His brain was basically revolting against him, his desire to thrive as an individual.
And you hear so many times people trying to quit drugs. They really want to quit. And if you could put a button in front of them and say, push this right now, and it would be stopped, they would push that button. We just don't have that button.
I have a question for Dr. Duffy. What do studies show is effective for prevention of substance use disorder?
So a lot of the research that's been done has actually been done in early childhood. So things like what they call the good behavior game. These are things that teach kids to make good choices and build resilience so they can, when they are confronted with the decision to take a drug, or they have peer pressure or whatever, they can make a different choice. Those have been shown in long-term follow-up studies to at least delay use of drugs and alcohol. We don't have enough, or maybe anything, for individuals. I'm talking about rigorously tested. I'm sure there are programs out there that may well work, but in terms of what the scientific literature is, we don't have a lot for kids who are the age you were talking about, that were sort of middle school and beyond, and young adults, to try to help them not use opioids in particular. NIH has just started a new initiative. It was another one of these healing initiative things that we have, to try to generate research on exactly that topic so that we can come up with some really evidence-based ways to do this. For now, we just don't have it.
I'm glad you used the word initiatives, because I got a question from the audience, which is part of that piece. How can we as citizens help with initiatives that support this opioid crisis, and what are those initiatives, whether they're locally, state, or federal? Go ahead, Shane.
So on a local level, I think there's a number of things that people can do. One is to obtain and train on Narcan, so that if you are confronted with a situation in the community, you're prepared to act. There are coalitions and groups like Harm Reduction Coalition, for example, that is doing work within the community. I think that on a daily basis, people can think critically about stigma and challenging stigmas, be cautious with our language. And the other thing that I would say is, as we make efforts to expand opportunity for treatment and intervention within our community, that folks consider supporting those, even if they're in their own neighborhoods, because that has been a significant issue.
Anybody else from the panel want to add to that? I got plenty of questions, so that's fine. Okay, this one is for Dr. Thomas. You mentioned the effects of prohibition earlier in your presentation. What do you think about decriminalization of drug use in other countries like Portugal, where they found some success in that? Is this something that the United States should move towards to?
I was getting some advice, I'm not sure. I think we got to move towards the disease model. And I'm not a criminal justice major. When I presented that, I put that as a key topic, which I don't have the answer for, but I do think that we should focus on science. And whatever the criminal justice system, whatever politicians figure out, that's with them. But the NIH is about science, and we need to understand the science of addiction better.
Anybody else? Yes.
I think we should make it a crime to advertise opioids on television. I think we should make it a crime for big pharma to push opioids and to lie to the public and tell them that opioids aren't addictive in the first place.
Also, what we know about our criminal justice system in this country is that people are not coming out of jails and prisons drastically improved people, right? That we know that the way that we go about our incarceration model is begetting multi-generational incarceration. And so I think while we need to think critically about drug policy, we also need to think critically about criminal justice policy and how we interface and interact with those folks.
So this question is probably for Michael and Shana. As we expand prevention services to youth, particularly in school setting, what steps are being taken to coordinate services with school districts?
Well, I think, I think there's a few things. One, and I know we've worked with Sheena's department for some time, and I know even right now in Santa Cruz City schools, I believe they still have the 7 challenges model, and that's often used as a sort of a suspension alternative, because as someone mentioned earlier in the day, that kicking them out of school doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? Or just like locking them up. And just as an aside, I do feel like our probation department here for youth does do a fairly good job, I think, at seeing mental health and substance use disorders as an underlying issue to treat, not just the subsequent crimes that may occur from those. And so there is a concerted effort there. I think this is actually an area where schools could improve, to be honest. That's why I sort of hesitated. I'm looking at Shayna. And I don't know that necessarily the concrete next step. I just mentioned to Shayna I wanted to get together with her earlier in the day. I do think, though, that 7 Challenges is already a basis. I know they're doing intensive outpatient services that exist through Encompass, and I think that's up and running now, and that's a great alternative. In my experience, to be honest, in mental health and substance use, it's not always a lack of services, it's how it's delivered and where it's delivered and who is the face of it. So we have found a huge increase in accessing mental health and substance use services when the practitioner is at the school site, perhaps in milieu at first, where they're at breaks, they're just walking in saying hi to the teacher. So it's a known person, it's accessible at the school site. There's somehow a huge drop-off when you say, now go to this other place at this other time. And maybe similar to, primary care physicians, where the person's there now wanting help, can you do it right then? So I think that's the direction that the schools need to go, is how to integrate it into the school community. And I'll bring it to the next Student Service Directors meeting and talk to Shayna next month, in March. Or it is March, right, this month. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that it is very much about the how. There's certainly space for expansion within our school systems of those services, but for me, it really is about building a relationship with the young person. That if you, say, hey, it looks like you're having a tough time. Do you want to go get some drug counseling? The answer is probably no. But if you, as a counselor, see that person in the hallways in the schools, and you're there every day, and you're a consistent fixture, and you start to build trust and talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about, which first couple of conversations, it's unlikely going to be about their substance use. To build that relationship and to kind of foster that trusting connection is critical in those attempts.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas, any new research regarding use of serotonins for addiction treatment? Anything out there?
I actually do not know. I know serotonin is involved with pain and stuff like that, and that you can use that system for pain control, but Sarah, do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. What I would say is go to NIH Reporter, and you can find whatever we're working on. You can search on serotonin and opioid use disorder and see if we've got anything. We've got studies that range from cellular all the way on up to big pragmatic clinical trials, so there may be something in there. The one that I found had to do with the dopamine receptor, which is a different.
And we do have within NIDA, we have a drug development division trying to come up with new treatments, and they're going at all sorts of different angles. We're not in that division. I know some of their lead topics, but I don't know about serotonin.
Well, thank you for the resources to those specific websites. How about treatment for women during pregnancy? Methadone versus buprenorphine or Suboxone. Is there a preference? Have we talked?
Anybody want to take that? I can.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think the standard of care right now is methadone or buprenorphine, the mono product, not the one with the naloxone on board. There's continuing research in that area to really try to understand whether those are the best ways to do it, and more about the effects on the infants. The research to date shows that it's really much better to have the mother being treated for their opioid use disorder than not for the infant and for the mother. Now, Trexone, to my knowledge, has not been tested or anything on women, pregnant women. You may know more than that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. The only thing I would add is that on a local level, we know that we are severely lacking in gender-responsive treatment opportunities, and so it's something that we would like to do more of.
So another question back to our youth. We work with many youth with learning disabilities, spectrum disorders, etc. How are SUD related to disability? with substance use related to that?
I don't know that I could speak from a scientific or survey sort of approach. And I did hear, was it someone that said with the couple IQ points were below folks who smoke marijuana, they didn't know which came first, chicken or the egg, right? Yeah.
It's like 5 points.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't even know if I want to speak anecdotally to this, but I do see in other sort of arenas that I work in gang prevention and homeless and foster youth and stuff, that at times students who have sort of comprehensive IEPs, intellectual disabilities, reading disorders, significant challenge in schools, that can be contributive, I think, to them perhaps not being engaged in school or being involved in other activities. And so I don't know if there's a correlation, I guess, but I do think that should be part of sort of student study team or multiple disciplinary team sort of thought process and looking at all the different factors and drivers that may be affecting behavior of a student. And so certainly should be considered, at least as part of the puzzle, in my opinion.
The next question is more towards Mr. and Mrs. McQuaid, and I want to try and ask this question as best I can. From your experience, what were some of the first signs, and for me as a parent as well, that gave you an indication there was an issue, and what resources do you know that you think would be helpful to other parents? And again, for me as a parent, I'm very interested.
So the indications that I had in watching Michael. So Michael was at Cabrillo College for his. He graduated from Cabrillo College, and while he was there, he was working at the Math Learning Center. He was a math tutor. He was doing really well, and he had a girlfriend who I really liked and thought, wow, things are going really well. And Michael, we had a history with Michael of him being very fascinated with drugs. So it wasn't all of a sudden. He actually was prescribed Vicodin for wisdom teeth pulling and for tonsillectomy, but that was a little bit before. So he had an ongoing fascination with drugs, and he was actually brilliant, very, very off the charts. And he broke up with this girlfriend after New Year's Eve. She was beautiful, and she was into him, and I just thought, this is great. He's doing really well. And because I was always vigilant and watching Michael, and always a little bit concerned with, are you high? Are you doing drugs? It was like that. And all of a sudden, he broke up with the girlfriend, and all of his friends weren't coming over anymore, and they were coming over a lot. He was very social. He loved people. He loved being around his friends, and that just dropped off. And he was rock climbing at the climbing gym, and he stopped going. And I was noticing changes, and I would ask him, Michael, is everything okay? Is everything okay? And he's like, yeah, Mom. Why do you keep asking me that? And I'd say, well, because it just seems like there's something going on. And, do you want to talk to somebody about it? It doesn't have to be me. He's like, Mom, I'm fine. I think I'm just tired of school. I'm just over it now, because he was graduating. And I'm like, okay. And I didn't feel good about it. And the other indication was that he wasn't enjoying food. Like he loved food, and we were always about food in the family. I was always cooking, we were always eating. He was living at home, and suddenly he just didn't have much of an interest in food anymore. So that was another indication, but I wasn't cluing into heroin or opioid addiction. I wasn't thinking addict at all. I was just thinking, wow, what's going on? I mean, did something happen with his girlfriend? And this kept going on. This went on for months, because I said he broke up with her in January, and I was constantly asking Tom, what do you think's going on? Something's going on. And then the other clue was we have a dog, and it was his dog. He loved this little dog. And she got out one day and ran across the street, and I said, oh, Michael's out, Moo's out, and Michael just laid on the couch, and that was not Michael. And so I was always just asking him, is everything okay? And then, so those were the things I saw, and finally he did tell us. But it took from January until May for him to tell us what happened. So there were months of just watching him become more and more addicted to heroin without us knowing it, and he was living at home.
Thank you for sharing that experience.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think that's the main point is it was behavioral changes. I forget which member of the panel mentioned that as opposed to specific symptoms, but his behavior changed significantly. And I think the thing Kelly forgot to mention was as he got into the heroin, its horrific effect he would start nodding a little bit at the table. I didn't know the first thing about opioids, but Kelly said, I think he might be doing heroin. And to me, this was like, come on, that's impossible. Our kid's not going to do heroin. But he was doing heroin. So the behavioral effects and then this nodding off effect, I think, were the two primary keys.
I actually saw him nod sitting on the couch. I never saw him nod at the dinner table, but he was acting strange at the dinner table too. But it was at the couch where he was laying back and just kind of falling asleep, which was also just nothing like his usual behavior. Sorry. So, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, just the point is that opioids do hijack your pleasure center. And obviously, he wasn't really finding very much pleasure in life anymore.
No, that's all right. Yeah, and just Sarah and I knew a really nice man, and we were very close with him. And what you were just describing was like him. He would nod and strange behavior we couldn't put our fingers on, and we didn't know he had a problem with his funeral. And so it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. I was in denial. Tom and I were both in denial. And I see parents in denial now about things, and I recognize it because I didn't know I was in denial at the time. And what was I going to say?
I think it just reinforces the need for awareness that it's not impossible for your child to be engaged with the drugs. And so you need to know that it's a real possibility. You need to be vigilant and trust that little voice when it starts to say, hey, something's not right.
Thank you. Dr. Duffy, what does the evidence say on increased risk of death and overdose after relapse for patients treated with naltrexone for opiate addiction?
Right. So I know that's a real concern about naltrexone because, it's an antagonist and you lose your tolerance and all that stuff. The science so far hasn't really borne that out. We've had but again, remember, there's not a lot of science out now about in the injectable form because it hasn't been around that long. But I showed you that one study where that got the FDA approval for it. There was a long-term follow-up study after that. From that study, they followed those patients longer, and they didn't see that any problems with overdosing after they got off the naltrexone. And it's starting to have been used long-term as well. But I just think that with any of these medications, and given, again, the danger lurking in the drug supply, that it's always something you want to consider, really, with anybody with an opioid use disorder, or anybody who's just misusing them. They don't have to have an a disorder. You want to make sure that they have access to naloxone. That, one of the big problems we have is people going and using by themselves. And as the doctor said, even if you have naloxone, that's not going to help because you can't use it on yourself. So you want to try to help people. Again, you might slip, you might not, yay. But if you do, you want to put yourself in a situation where you're going to lower that risk of death. So no alcohol, no benzos, have naloxone around and let somebody watch you.
So this question is primarily for Shayna or also Michael. Are there local resources available for children whose parents have substance use issues? other than like Alateen or a therapist? Is there anything out there that we have locally?
It's a great question. I think that the resources that exist are not necessarily specialized to that population. There certainly are mental health services and resilience services available throughout our community. They may not necessarily focus on that particular issue, but that's something to keep in mind as we continue to expand our services.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. I do know, and I apologize for getting the name of it. There is a specialized service for pregnant women who are addicted, and so I do know of that, and that's obviously prior to birth. But yeah, I think this is part of I kind of like the idea again, the healing initiatives. I didn't know about that till today, so I'm very happy to hear about it, and I think that that's something that even obviously if we're not chosen as an official applicant, that we can certainly learn from it, and even the idea of it, I think, is something that I'm kind of excited to move towards. And I thought of you, Kelly, as you spoke. I think it's natural for parents to be in denial, to see symptoms, behavior changes. You don't want to think the worst, or you want to think the best typically. But if there's a community that's wrapped a little tighter, then, maybe the school nurse, for instance, who's not the mom, right? Or the teacher, or the aide, or other folks. And so perhaps an extension of services for those parents even. Because sometimes kids are reacting, of course, to their parents' use, which has a whole slew of behaviors we see that isn't necessarily them using, but it's really part of the root of the system solving is helping the parents too.
I'll add that one thing that is happening that is related but not necessarily specifically what the question was is a Justice and Gender Task Force activity within our community, which is supported by the Board of Supervisors. And one of the things that we're addressing is, for example, when a parent is incarcerated at the time of arrest, what's happening with that child and how do we reduce trauma in those instances. So there's some attention in that realm.
So we're getting close to about 10 minutes, and I got still a lot of questions from the audience. So we're going to kind of speed question and speed answer those. I know I'm not going to get through them all, but I want to make sure that everybody at least gets a chance. Dr. Duffy, when an individual has stopped using, what is the approximate time range for the brain to return closer to pre-mortem?
That's a very good question, to which I think Dave might know the answer. I know I don't know it for opioids. I think for methamphetamine, is that what Nora did her slides on? It's years. I mean, it's not immediate by any stretch of the imagination. Our institute director has done brain scans of individuals who are addicted and then followed up several years after once they've stopped using. And she does show that the brain goes back, but it's not, and that's activity in the brain that you can see in neuroimaging. But it's not anything that happens real quick.
So maybe a follow-up question. Is there a risk of relying too heavily on medication at the expense of other modalities?
I think particularly, one of the things we've been talking about is individuals who have multiple things going on. So I think for opioid use disorder, again, the evidence says to me that you're not relying on medications. You're using a medication that has been shown to be effective in getting people not to use and stay in treatment and have better outcomes. So I don't know that it's a question of one or the other. I think it needs to be patient-centered. And if the individual needs additional treatments, what I think the emerging evidence is telling us is that you don't want to force the other things on the patient if that means that they're not going to be able to get the medications. Get them on the medications in a safe, effective manner. And then I talked about the interim methadone studies. I know I'm not being quick. But one of the things they found is they got these people stabilized, and then they're like, could I have some of that counseling and treatment? I think that might help me. So it's an approach like that. So.
Yeah. I'd echo that voice and choice that people have the right to choose from a menu of options what they think is going to be most impactful for them, and the right to change their minds at any point in their treatment course about what is and is not being effective for them.
There's one last question from the audience for the McQuades. They're wondering what sort of healing process you and your family have gone through that can give hope to parents struggling today.
Struggling with grief or with their children using substances?
Both. That's a tough question. I know.
I don't really know how to answer that. What process have we gone through?
Yeah, for part of the healing process moving forward for you.
The healing process started with the funeral, the community that came and wrapped their arms around us, the man who presided over Michael's funeral was Michael Millward. He's the CEO of Hospice of Santa Cruz, and he did an amazing job for us. Children lined up and told stories about Michael, and adults who were in Michael's lives came and told stories about him. So that was helpful. The process for me, I think it's a very individual thing, was to go into counseling right away, grief counseling with Hospice of Santa Cruz. I should talk faster. And they helped me, and then I went into counseling after that because you only get 12 weeks with them. And we went into couples grief counseling. And then I have a very close girlfriend who helped me. We hiked together every week, and she actually is a social worker, and that was not why we were friends. She just was incredible with me, just very loving. I think finding your people and knowing who you can talk to and knowing who will support you is part of your healing process. And I do feel grateful to live in this community because there are so many compassionate and kind and loving people that have really helped me get through this, because it's an incredibly painful, devastating thing you live with for the rest of your life, but you learn how to live with it, and the people that you surround yourself with are the ones who help, I think. And Tom and I feel really lucky to be married to Tom because he's very loving and solid and compassionate and just really there for me.
Yeah, as Kelly mentioned, Michael Millward, he from hospice, when he met with us the first time, he said, you know, you've lost your leg, you've lost a leg, and now you need to learn how to walk with a limp. And that's what we've been doing. You don't get over it. You learn to walk with a limp. And, being here today, I think, is, one way to maybe help heal. One thing you go through when you lose a child is the sense of failure. The parents' primary responsibility is to get that kid alive into adulthood. So you actually have to end up asking yourself, what the hell did I do wrong? What could I have done different? And so, that's when you need community to kind of hold you up a little bit, reaffirm that, it's not necessarily your fault. And so that's one of the reasons we're here today, I think, is just to give a voice and say, if anyone needs to talk, we're here, and we'll help hold you up.
Thank you. One last question for Dr. Thomas and Dr. Duffy. Why does there seem to be a disconnect or lack of collaboration between psychiatry and addiction medicine?
Well, we have a lot of psychiatrists who are addiction medicine specialists, so it's not completely different. I think this is a little bit of a history lesson around funding. So, so it used to be medical care was medical care, but then mental health and substance use got neglected, so they kind of split off. Mental health was with substance abuse, but then mental health, substance abuse got neglected, so it split off. It's also sort of it's a slightly different approach, slightly different ideas about what works, what doesn't. But I think that, and there are psychiatrists who don't want to have anything to do with substance abuse, and there are mental health, there are substance abuse people in the day who didn't want to deal with mental health. You had to fix one before you could fix the other. Now we know that that's really not a healthy approach for people. So I would say it's getting better. I think we don't have enough addiction medicine specialists overall in whatever field of medicine it is. And that's why I was delighted to hear about the residencies and things that are going on. But it's historical and it's mainly money.
And just to relate this to pain, I mentioned earlier that there's very little pain education in medical schools and various other clinical schools. There's not much drug abuse education either. So clinicians tend to go to the pain specialists with difficult people, and the MDs go to addiction specialists.
What I'd like to ask the panel, within 30 seconds, each.
Okay.
You each have 30 seconds.
You go first.
Closing comments from your perspective and your expertise that you can offer to our community to fight against this opiate addiction issues.
I think there are myriad ways that folks can get involved and be an advocate. I think a good first step is to be here today, to have learned what you've learned, to learn about resources, and move from sort of being a learner to being a champion in our community for the rights of people who are struggling with substance use disorder, with mental health issues, with homelessness, with all of these sort of chronic issues that we know exist in our community, and think critically about how can you, maybe that's in very small ways, but how can you step up to the plate and instead of being someone who talks about advocating for these folks, be someone who advocates for these folks.
Dr. Duffy, 30 seconds.
I would say, adding to that, with which I agree, be patient. This is a hard issue. It took us a while to get into it. It's going to take us a while to get out of it. When you encounter that person who's had treatment for the 16th time, remember that means that they're not being treated correctly. They should not have gone in and out. They should have been in treatment that whole time in some way, maybe not as intensive. But compassion and patience.
Dr. Thomas.
Yeah, I guess I'll direct it to you folks. It's not your fault. I mean, drug addiction is insidious, and you can't stop it, and we're trying to do better. And the fact that you're coming out here, there's stigma is our enemy, community is our friend. You coming out here helps bring it to light better, and the more it's in light here, the better it will be.
Ms. McWade?
We really do need to talk about it a lot, and we need to open up to each other. Everybody in here has their story and their pains, and we shouldn't be underground. Don't go underground with your problems. Bring them out into the open and trust your community. They'll be there for you. I think it's so important. I had a student tell me in high school, she was in the health office, and she said she was in there for depression and anxiety, and she said, you have children to talk to, friends to talk to? And she said, yeah, but you know what? Me and my friends, we all think we need group therapy. And she's right. We need group therapy. And here we are the community, and we can help each other by opening up. I feel like there is so much stigma around this. We go underground with it, and that gives the addiction power. It's giving this disease the power to take more lives, to take more victims.
Thank you. Mr. McCabe?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the most important thing that we could do is educate ourselves and prevent people from taking that first pill. Kids start smoking before they're 15, they're gonna smoke their whole life. Ads, like those Camel ads, increased Camels use amongst kids from 0.5% to 32%. Alcohol commercials target kids. Pills are being advertised on TV. Pills are being glamorized in TV and movies and songs. Now, I know I'm an American, I love my freedom, but you know what? We need to counteract that message with the knowledge that these things can kill Fentanyl, the equivalent of 3 grams of sugar, 3 little grams of sugar. And now today I heard, 2 milligrams. And now today I heard that there's carfentanil, that's 50 to 100 times more powerful than fentanyl. I mean, my God. There's no room, taking pills, doing drugs, doing pot is not a rite of passage. It's a highway to death, and the kids got to realize that, and the parents have to realize that, because that's the reality of it.
Michael, very quickly.
I'm going to take 2 seconds.
Please.
And don't be angry with your children if they come to you. You don't have time to be angry with them. You don't have time to be ashamed. You don't, and please don't shame your children if they do come to you. Don't shame them. It's so damaging. Just help them, love them, and help them and get the treatment they need, and educate yourselves about what they're telling you about.
Thank you.
I think just to continue on that theme, and I could just say, let's see, 3 of Shayna's slides, because I took lots of notes, and I think schools, besides maybe doing more, I heard about some parenting awareness classes in Santa Cruz City, and that we also need those, I think, for students and staff, and maybe also get trained on Narcan usage, right? But I think, in general, Shane, I don't know which slide it was, but you kind of went through a whole series of sort of ways to be available to youth, right? Or to anybody really, around non-judgmental language, trauma-informed care, safety, and I think the more that every school sort of staff person is able to be that, then that gives options for students to be able to approach when they are having struggles. Hopefully won't feel stigmatized or ashamed if we use that kind of language and approach. And so that's my hope. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists, please? Karen's going to come up and give some closing remarks. I wanted to remind everybody to make sure that you validate your ticket before you leave. The stations are out in the entryway. And everybody, here's Karen.
Well, just a round of applause for Rudy for being such a great moderator. Thank you, Rudy. I want one more time to thank all of our presenters, not just for your time here today and your expertise, but for everything you do every day to help our community and help our youth and our grown-ups. So thank you for everything you do. You're amazing. And again, to reiterate the thanks to all of you for all the work that you guys do every day. I feel extremely proud to be part of a community that is working so hard to pull together, and I know that from this, that we're going to be able to pull together, continue to build community and help everybody who lives here. So I want to say thank you very much to you, and we hope we see you next year. Thank you.